Sydney Australia's light rail network has generally been accepted as a huge success. And for a network that is not that large relative to some in the world, it does seem to have a pretty constant presence in the daily news cycle in its hometown of Sydney. A lot of it has been on sort of negative operational issues like cracks in trams, overcrowding, and more recently, industrial action and even trees falling on trams. But also balanced with great news that the under construction Parramatta Light Rail Line is now in full operational trials, ready for opening in later 2024. And even more recently, something that generated quite a bit of media coverage is the proposal to extend the network even further with a new line connecting Taverners Hill on Parramatta Road in the inner west to Green Square in the inner south via Central Railway Station. So what's it all about, and will it ever be built? And that's the topic of today's video. I'm Marty, and welcome to BackTracks. Trams were once nearly everywhere in Sydney, but by 1961, they weren't, because they were ripped up and replaced generally by buses. And trams then didn't run in Sydney streets for another 35 years, until the T1 light rail line opened in 1997. Let's take a quick look at what the network looks like today before we look to the future. In mid-2024, the network consists of 3 passenger routes. The L1 Dulwich Hill line was the network's first line, and it commenced in August 1997 and it reached its full extent in 2014. Its nearly 13-kilometre route runs between Central Station and Dulwich Hill, stopping at 23 stops along the route. It connects the city centre with Darling Harbour, the Pyrmont Peninsula, and then Sydney's inner west, right out to the Bankstown Railway line. The L2 Randwick line and the L3 Kingsford line are the newest lines. L2 Randwick started in December 2019 and L3 Kingsford operated from 2020. They operate what they call the CBD and Southeast Light Rail between Circular Quay at the northern end of the city centre to Central Station at the southern end, and then continuing to the southeastern suburbs. And unlike the inner west light rail, the line is mostly on street and follows a similar path to routes that were used by the former tramway network. The fourth line, which is very creatively called the L4, will run between Westmead via the Parramatta City Centre and Carlingford, and it's planned to open in August 2024. And they're now at the point where they've been able to drive trams into the city centre and give people a look inside the trams during open days. And the preferred route for the second Parramatta line has been announced. You don't have to be Einstein to guess it's going to be called the L5. And this fifth line, which is still in its planning stages, will branch from the L4 line at Camellia and travel through Ermington, Melrose Park, Wentworth Point, and on to the Sydney Olympic Park precincts. But the most significant recent news, and the topic of today's video, is a proposal from Track Consortium to build what would be the 6th light rail line in Sydney, running from Green Square, north to Waterloo and Redfern, through Central Railway Station, then turn west to go through Railway Square, Broadway, continue west along Parramatta Road past Norton Street to Taverners Hill, which would then connect with the L1 tram line. And we'll look at the line in 2 parts. Let's start with Green Square to Central. This alignment's around 4.5 kilometres long. The start or end of the line would be right outside Green Square Railway Station, which is on the T8 Airport and South Line. Of interest, the design of the square already safeguarded a 12-metre wide corridor for the light rail. That was good planning ahead. And it's not the first time trams have been to Green Square, because the original Botany tram line ran right past here along Botany Road. From Green Square, the proposed line would head east, and it passes over Joynton Avenue, along which the original Rosebery tram line ran along, and then through what is today a very large Ausgrid electricity depot. And there's a lot of vacant land in this area, and this is where the second stop is planned. And I should note that station names have not officially been proposed, so I'm sort of making them up where I couldn't see an actual name in the document. Then from here it turns right and heads north along DeFries Avenue to outside East Village Shopping Centre, before then joining Gadigal Avenue continuing north. As it heads north, it passes over O'Day Avenue, which also had a tram line once running along it, which was a non-passenger line connecting the Botany and Rosebery lines to the large Dowling Street depot, where the Moore Park Supercentre now stands. Darling Street Depot was the largest in Australia. I guess you could call it a supercentre for trams, because it had 300 trams at its peak and nearly 1,000 workers. Now back to the present day and the L6 line, and we arrive at stop 4, which could be called Hatbox Place, or I guess Woolaba Park. There's a very nice medium strip here that would have to be removed to build the station. As we continue to head north, we then pass a heritage-listed chimney. And according to the documentation, the close distance between the intersections here means quite tricky geometry for the tracks. There are actually a couple of different alternatives where the line could go. And here we reach stop 5, which will have side platforms, and it appears to be planned for right at this pedestrian crossing between Crystal Park and Crown Park. It's a pretty nice place, tucked away from the bustle of the surrounding streets. From here it continues to head north through the pedestrian mall in what I guess you could call the Meriton Retail Precinct. And from here, the proposed line would turn west along Phillip Street, Redfern, where the 6th stop is proposed. The former West Kensington tram line once ran along Phillip Street to South Dowling Street. And as we continue to head west, the line would then head north at Redfern Oval and Redfern Park, crossing Redfern Street. And this is where we see current and future images of this intersection. We leave here and the line will continue along Chalmers Street. And Chalmers Street carried the original tram lines to Botany, Alexandria and Daceyville. And then it crosses Cleveland Street, which was also a very busy former tram route. And here we find stop 8, which could have a number of names, Cleveland Street or Belvoir Street or probably something else. And while I was driving along here, I hit a pothole and I stopped because I said, my gosh, I think that's old tram tracks. It looks like it could have been part of a crossover. There was a crossover around this spot. Cool, if it is. I guess they'll be digging up a lot of old tram lines when they build this new light rail. And as it's planned, this new L6 line will join up the L2 and L3 at the central Chalmers Street station, where passengers obviously can join the L2 and L3 line to head southeast or up to George Street. And it's just a short walk across to Central Railway Station to the T1 line, which you can catch to Dulwich Hill. In the proposal, it mentions because it would connect with the L2 and the L3 line, it is assumed they would use the same trams as on those lines. Then from here, trams would travel along the same tracks as the L2 and L3 line along Eddy Avenue. After Eddy Avenue, the new line would then turn south, away from the T2 and T3 lines, and head southwest to Railway Square, which was the major hub of the original Sydney tramway network. And this shot shows the complexity of all the trams operating in this area. And now let's look at the second section of the line, and we'll start from the western end of Parramatta Road and come back to Central. And that is about 6.5 kilometres long. News of a Parramatta tram line being proposed would have been something you read about back in 1882, as this was when the first trams ran down Parramatta Road. The 21st stop is what's sort of called in the documentation as Taverners Hill, and judging by the map, it's right outside the Marco Polo Motel, which if you'd like to stay there, it's got Foxtel. Then it travels under 3 bridges, in effect. One of them is carrying the L1 light rail line, so you'll have an easy interchange with the Taverners Hill stop on the L1 line. The next stop, stop 20, is described as Carrington Street. And then continuing to head east towards the city, stop 19 is Elswick Street. And you see in this video here, this pedestrian bridge. Apparently it's too low for overhead wires. So at this point, the trams may need to have wire-free running. And from here, the line basically heads east along Parramatta Road, right back to Broadway, Railway Square and the city. As we travel back, let's talk a little bit about the history of trams on Parramatta Road. The peak of trams in the inner west and inner southwest. Trams ran down George Street West, which is now called Broadway, which then becomes Parramatta Road. And I counted it up, and there was probably at least 10 different western lines serviced by the strip of road. Trams ran to Pyrmont and Ryde, Glebe Point, Balmain, Lilyfield, Petersham, Newtown, Canterbury, and to Abbotsford, and Leichhardt, basically to a range of places north and south of Parramatta Road. What will the new line look like? To put in the tram lines, 2 lanes of traffic will be lost on Parramatta Road, but the Track document says that one tram can carry 450 people, which is up to 9 regular buses. So in effect, they're saying that there'll be less buses, so they won't need the bus lanes, which mean the same amount of lanes for regular traffic. And when the line gets to Central, and when it gets back to Central, the line does turn south to Green Square, but there's a possibility trams could run up George Street to Circular Quay on special events. So I guess we've reached the point of the conversation is, will this ever happen? Or is this just a lovely glossy proposal and a few YouTube videos? Once the proposal was released, it did generate quite a bit of news coverage. And most of that coverage was pretty positive. But the most important aside on this project is the New South Wales government. Well, the New South Wales government said their focus will be on improving bus services along the line, and the Premier himself has directly rejected the proposal. But it does have the support of the local councils, and Sydney Lord Mayor Clover Moore has proposed 100 million Australian dollars to help with all the public domain improvements along the section of the line from Green Square to Broadway, which is in the city of Sydney. And that would include footpath widening, tree planting, new street furniture, paving and lighting, etc. And the Inner West Council has said that major public transport intervention was the only thing to revitalise Parramatta Road and open the way up for more higher density housing along the corridor. So, will it ever be built? Gosh, who knows? But a project like this has to start somewhere, and the proposal is a first step. And while the New South Wales government is not yet on board, in fact, as I said, it flatly rejected the plan, the local councils are, and we also know state governments do change their mind, and state governments do change. But one thing for certain, that this proposal will help to keep light rail in the news for many months and years to come, and provide some good content for YouTube video makers like me. Well, there we have it. The story of a maybe never to be built new tram line in Sydney, but one can only dream. And we'll see you next time when we look at the past, the present and the future of public transport in Australia and around the world. See you later.